Hello, my name is Stephen Benson, and today my presentation will be about the fantasy football discourse community. So, fantasy football is a game typically played between 6 to 16 people, where each player builds a team using real NFL players, and they'll compete based on their actual game performances. So, they'll draft players before the season and earn points each week for stats like touchdowns and yards and interceptions and stuff like that. So each week, you'll face another team in your league, and the one with the most points that week will win that week. And then throughout the season, you can adjust your lineup, trade players, pick up free agents to try and improve your team. And the goal for each player is to make the playoffs and win the championship. So the game of fantasy football is held on applications such as ESPN, and Sleeper and Yahoo, but other websites such as Reddit and Fantasy Pros and Keep Trade Cut are used as well as information sources by the community. I play fantasy football myself, and I browse the fantasy football Reddit pretty often. And it's the off season right now, and even in the off season, the community is always talking about hypothetical trades or how they value certain players or certain things like that, even in the off season. So the community, I think, stays pretty active year round. The genres of communication in this community include player rankings, mock drafts, and various sports articles used by the members to build the best fantasy team possible. As for the Lexus, there's certain terms used by fantasy players, like ADP, Superflex, and waiver wire, that only fantasy football players would understand. And it's also free and available for anyone to join. You just need an internet connection. So for this project, we had to conduct secondary research, which was, basically research. I had to look up an article that under an approved source. Used NC Live to get just some articles on the topics of my Discourse community just to learn more about it. So the first article was from David Coulomb and Mark Grivis and Colin O'Gara. It was titled Fantasy Football Playing and Internet Addiction Among Online Fantasy Football Participants, a Descriptive Survey Study. So this article was a bit concerning as a fantasy football player myself, as it goes into the risks and the negative effects that fantasy football brings. From internet or media addiction to gambling issues, fantasy sports players must be very cautious about the time that they're putting into this game. With the newly addition of like daily fantasy sports and gambling and stuff like that in North Carolina, the gambling in fantasy football has also become very common, and the websites that the leagues are hosted on, like ESPN and Sleeper or whatever, there's constantly gambling advertisements or promotions that they're trying to get you to sign up with. So that's what that whole article was about. It just kind of opened my eyes, made me more aware to the dangers of fantasy football. The second article was by Michael Lee and Leo Siki. Not sure if I said that right. And it was the drafting strategies in fantasy football, a study of competitive sequential human decision making. And this article just went into depth. There's a ton of different strategies in fantasy football. If you want to prioritize certain players or certain positions over others, and but this article went into depth on those different strategies, and it explained how it's played and why managers make the certain decisions they do. From the draft to the waiver wire additions and the trades, everyone wants their team to, win the most games and put the most fantasy points up on the scoreboard. So, there's many different strategies, and this article provides the statistics to analyze which one's the best to move forward with on draft day. He analyzed like the average draft positions of the players from the 2022 NFL season from a fantasy perspective to give the reader insight to what's going on in the mind of like a fantasy player when they're looking at the NFL players. So that was what that article was about. The third article from Tyler Ratz and a few others was titled Evaluating the Motivations Driving Fantasy Football Participants in Selecting Fantasy Football Analysts for Information Consumption. The fantasy football industry has grown significantly over the past decade, reaching a value of about $22 billion in recent years. The authors acknowledge that a large part of this growth is due to media consumption, and this article analyzed the reasons people choose certain analysts for their fantasy football advice. Although fantasy football is just a game at its core, some leagues, they play for money, and the first place prize can, be like $500 or something. If it's like a $50 buy-in. So the leagues can be pretty serious, and people want the best information possible. So this article just kind of went into depth on why people choose the information that they do for fantasy football. So yeah, with the article takeaways, it kind of just opened my eyes to the whole gambling and media consumption aspect of the game, and it's definitely something to be aware of. And also just remember that fantasy football is a game at its core, and it's there's a lot of luck involved and can be won with many different types of strategies. So also for the this assignment, we had to do primary research, which was like basically go out and do our own research. So I interviewed my father, who's been playing fantasy football for over 20 years now, and he actually won his, he plays in his work, his job has a league going with like 12 or 14 people or something, and they play for money every year, and he's won the past 2 years for them, so I considered him an expert. So the first question that I asked him are, what are the different types of league formats for fantasy football, and how do the draft strategies differ between them? And he explained 3 different types. So he responded with, dynasty leagues are where you essentially keep the team that you draft forever. Each season, there will be a rookie draft between fantasy managers for the incoming NFL rookies. And as far as a draft strategy for this type of format, he prioritized the younger studs. He didn't stay away from the older, more injury-prone guys. Redraft leagues are reset each season. Each fantasy manager will draft from the entire pool of NFL players at the beginning of every season. This is the most common way to play fantasy football. For this league, he prioritized drafting strong running backs. He feels they're the most consistent position in fantasy football as far as scoring goes. And keeper leagues are where you can keep 1 to 3 players from your team every season at the cost of a draft pick for the next season. It depends on your league settings. And he treats these leagues as a pseudo-dynasty league. He prioritizes the strong young players that can carry your team for the long haul. The second question I asked him was, how has owning a fantasy football team changed your experience as an NFL fan? And he responded with, it gives me more to root for. I'm a loyal Raiders fan, so I will always be rooting for them, but I also root for the players on my fantasy team. It keeps me engaged in every game, not just the Raiders games. It's also a great way to interact with the other NFL fans. Between the trades, the draft, the waiver additions, fantasy football makes you feel like the general manager of your own team for that season. The third question I asked him was, how do you feel about the prevalence of gambling in fantasy sports? And he responded with, the NFL in general is just ridden with online gambling advertisements. I'm not a huge fan of how easily gambling is nowadays, and if I were uncomfortable with my gambling habits, I don't know if I would play fantasy sports. There are just too many opportunities to place bets on the fantasy apps, and it would not be best to surround yourself with those choices. The fourth question I asked him, and also I originally asked him 10 questions, but I chose 4 of them just to keep it short. So the fourth question that I asked him was, with fantasy football being held on apps such as Sleeper and ESPN, do you find yourself ever gambling on sports, and if so, how often? And he said, yes, I used to have to go down to the casinos to place bets, so I wouldn't do it very often, but now it's as easy to gamble on sports as it is to order something off Amazon. Every time there's a commercial break during a game, they're advertising FanDuel or DraftKings Online sports gambling has become very popular in the past few years. I would probably place a bet for every Raiders game and big Ole Miss game. So, to reflect, overall, research in the fantasy football community discourse. So, I'm sorry. Overall, researching the fantasy football discourse community over the course of this project has given me a deeper understanding of fantasy football in general. I've been playing for a little over 5 years now, and the growth I've seen since I've been a part of the community has been tremendous. I had a great time researching this project because it was a topic that actually interests me. Each article included in my research was filled with information on the community, both good and bad. They gave me insight on how people play the game, as well as some of the dangers the community faces, such as bad gambling habits or unhealthy media consumption. With online sports gambling becoming legal in recent years, I felt this project was a great way to increase my awareness on the matter, as knowledge is power. So initially interviewing my dad was a little bit unsettling because I wasn't sure how to determine what an expert in the field was in the first place with this community. But he's been playing for a long time and he's won a few recently, so I figured he was more of an expert than anybody I knew. And also in one of his questions, he responded with, "I only play for fun," which had me worried because that didn't sound like the answer of an expert. But later in the interview, it made me think maybe you can have fun at the game and be an expert at the same time. He shared some great insight on the decisions he makes in season, as well as his take on the gambling aspect of it all. All in all, I believe I made the right choice to interview him. To sum it all up, I enjoyed learning all about the ins and outs of the fantasy football community and its impact on the NFL fan experience. This project has also given me a structure on how future research projects should be done.